The silence in the house was louder than the waves crashing just beyond the garden wall. Matteo, 72 years old, sat alone at his kitchen table, the Andalusian sun slicing through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. 2 years. 2 years since Elena's sudden departure had ripped the heart out of this small whitewashed house, leaving behind an echo shaped like her absence. He traced the rim of his coffee cup, a chipped relic from a set they'd bought decades ago in Malaga. His routine was immutable. Coffee, a slow walk along the Paseo Maritimo, if his left knee allowed, tending minimally to the parched garden, solitary meals eaten while staring at the faded photograph of Elena smiling beside the vibrant bougainvillea that now drooped, neglected. His white hair, still thick, was combed carefully, a habit ingrained from years of wanting to look presentable for Elena. Even if now there was no one to see but the occasional neighbour he deliberately avoided. His brown eyes, deep set beneath bushy brows, held a persistent melancholy, a wariness that went beyond physical aches. He pushed himself up from the table, the familiar stiffness in his knee protesting. Time stretched before him, vast and empty as the Mediterranean Sea, shimmering under the relentless sun. The cheerful brightness of the coastal town, the scent of jasmine drifting from nearby patios, the distant chatter from the plaza, it all felt like a mockery of the grey landscape within him. He shuffled towards the garden, the silence following him like a shroud. Elena would have scolded him about the wilting geraniums, her voice sharp but loving. Now, only the whisper of the sea breeze answered his unspoken thoughts. He picked up a rusty trowel, intending to clear some weeds, but a wave of dizziness washed over him. The blue sky tilted precariously. He gripped the edge of a terracotta pot, breathing heavily until the world steadied. It wasn't the first time. Just age, he told himself, just the body winding down. But a cold knot of fear tightened in his chest. What if? He couldn't finish the thought. Being alone was one thing. Being alone and helpless was another entirely. The trowel fell from his hand, clattering onto the dry earth. Perhaps it was time to see Dr. Ramirez. The thought was unwelcome. He hadn't seen the doctor since Elena's passing, avoiding the pitying glances, the gentle inquiries about how he was coping. Coping. As if grief were a leaky tap you could eventually tighten shut. The waiting room at Dr. Ramirez's clinic was cool and quiet, smelling faintly of antiseptic and floor polish. Matteo sat stiffly on the plastic chair, feeling out of place, exposed. He hadn't wanted to call Sophia, his daughter, knowing she would fuss, maybe even insist on coming down from Seville. He could manage this himself. He was still Matteo, after all. Dr. Ramirez was younger than Matteo remembered, his face kind but professional behind neat spectacles. The checkup was thorough. Blood pressure, listening to his chest, questions about diet and sleep. Everything seems physically sound for a man of your age, Matteo, the doctor said finally, leaning back in his chair. Blood pressure is a little high but manageable. The dizziness, likely dehydration, or perhaps just postural. We'll keep an eye on it. Matteo nodded, relieved but also strangely deflated. He prepared to leave, already formulating excuses to avoid any further conversation. But Matteo, Dr. Ramirez continued, his gaze steady, physical health is only part of the picture. How are you really? Sleep? Appetite? Are you seeing people? Matteo bristled. I sleep fine. I eat. He mumbled, avoiding the doctor's eyes. The town is quiet. It can be, the doctor agreed softly. Loneliness is hard on the heart too, you know, not just the muscle. He paused, letting the silence stretch. It's natural, Matteo. Natural to need connection. Throughout life, it doesn't stop at a certain age. Connection. The word hung in the air, heavy and unwanted. Matteo mumbled a non-committal reply, gathered his worn Guayabera shirt around him, and almost fled the room. He walked home under the harsh midday sun, the doctor's words echoing in his ears. Natural, need, connection. He felt a flicker of something akin to anger, quickly followed by a familiar wave of shame. What did Ramirez know? Needs, at his age? It felt indecent. Elena was gone. That part of his life was over, wasn't it? The sea breeze felt cold against his skin, despite the heat. Sophia called that evening, her voice tinny through the phone line. Papa, how are you? You sound tired. I'm fine. Hija, Matteo lied, the word tasting like sawdust. Just the heat. You should get out more, she urged, her usual refrain. They have activities at the Serramares, Papa. Cards, dominoes, maybe just for coffee. Too noisy. Matteo grumbled. Old gossips. Maybe, Sophia conceded, but better than talking to the walls, no? There was a pause. I worry about you. No need to worry, he said, forcing a lightness he didn't feel. I saw Dr. Ramirez today, just a check-up. He said I'm fit as a fiddle. He omitted the rest of the conversation. After hanging up, the silence descended again, heavier than before. He looked at Elena's photograph. What would she say? She'd probably agree with Sophia, tell him to stop moping. But Elena she hadn't understood either, not really. Not in those later years. Their intimacy had faded, dwindling from passion into comfortable companionship, then into something unspoken, a distance he hadn't known how to bridge. Her discomfort, her quiet refusals, he'd felt rejected, confused, but pride had kept him silent. Had she felt lonely too, lying beside him in the dark? The thought was a fresh stab of guilt. A few days later, driven by a restless boredom he couldn't articulate, Matteo found himself walking towards the Centro de Mayores. It was housed in a bright modern building near the plaza. He hesitated at the entrance, the sound of chatter and laughter spilling out. He almost turned back, but the memory of Dr. Ramirez's words, Sophia's worried voice, pushed him forward. Inside, small groups sat around tables playing cards or dominoes, their voices animated. He felt conspicuous, an intruder. He ordered a coffee at the small bar, intending to drink it quickly and leave. "You're new here?" A voice beside him, warm and slightly husky. He turned. A woman, perhaps a few years younger than him, stood there, smiling. She had lively dark eyes that crinkled at the corners, silver-streaked hair cut stylishly short, and wore a colourful scarf draped artfully around her neck. There was an energy about her that seemed incongruous with the quiet resignation he felt in himself. "Matteo," he mumbled, nodding curtly. "Isabella," she offered, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, confident. "Don't worry, we don't bite, mostly." Her eyes twinkled. He managed a small, stiff smile. "Just having a coffee." "The coffee's not bad," she said agreeably. "Better than staying home staring at four walls, eh?" She spoke with a frankness that was both disarming and slightly unsettling. He didn't know how to respond. He took a sip of his coffee, the bitterness grounding him. Isabella didn't seem to mind his silence. She chatted easily about the upcoming fiesta, the heatwave, a particularly stubborn crossword clue. Matteo found himself listening despite his initial resistance. Her directness was unusual, but there was a kindness in her manner, an absence of the pity he dreaded. He finished his coffee and made his excuses. "Nice to meet you," he said, the politeness automatic. "You too, Matteo," Isabella replied, her smile genuine. "Maybe see you again?" He gave a non-committal shrug and escaped back into the sunlight, his heart beating slightly faster. The encounter left him feeling strangely agitated. Her openness, her vitality, it was a stark contrast to his own muted existence. It reminded him of things he'd tried hard to forget, laughter, easy conversation, the simple warmth of companionship, and something else, a faint stirring, quickly suppressed, that felt dangerously close to interest. He pushed the thought away. He was too old, it was disloyal to Elena. Yet a few days later he found himself back at the centre. He told himself it was just for the coffee, a change of scenery. Isabella was there again, playing dominoes with fierce concentration. She looked up as he entered, gave him a brief wave and a smile, then turned back to her game. Strangely, her lack of immediate attention was a relief. He sat at a corner table, observing. He saw the easy camaraderie between the regulars, the shared jokes, the arguments over game scores. It was a world humming with a low-level life he had shut himself off from. Over the next few weeks, a tentative pattern emerged. Matteo would visit the centre occasionally. Sometimes he and Isabella exchanged a few words. Sometimes they just nodded. He learned she was also widowed, her husband Antonio having passed away 3 years prior after a long illness. Unlike him, she seemed determined to embrace life, filling her days with activities, friends, even trips organised by the centre. One afternoon, sitting opposite her during a quiet moment, she asked him directly, "What did you do before, Matteo? Before retirement?" He hesitated, unused to talking about himself. "I was a carpenter," he said finally. "Made furniture, mostly." Her eyes lit up. "Ah, a craftsman. Antonio loved working with wood too, in his shed, always sanding something." She spoke of her late husband easily, with affection, but without the suffocating grief Matteo felt clung to him. He found himself talking about the grain of different woods, the satisfaction of a well-made joint. It was the most he'd spoken to anyone, besides Sophia, in months. Isabella listened intently, asking questions, sharing anecdotes about Antonio's less successful projects. For a short while, Matteo forgot his loneliness, caught up in the simple pleasure of shared interest. But later, walking home as the sun dipped towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the guilt returned. Talking about his work, sharing something personal, it felt like a betrayal of Elena, of the private world they had shared. And the flicker of warmth he felt towards Isabella, the ease of their conversation, that felt even worse. He found himself standing before Elena's photograph, whispering apologies into the empty room. He started having trouble sleeping. Not the deep, dreamless sleep of exhaustion he usually craved, but a restless tossing, punctuated by confusing dreams. Sometimes Elena was there, young and vibrant, laughing as they danced on the beach. Other times he felt a vague physical longing, a warmth spreading through him that left him feeling ashamed and bewildered upon waking. He was an old man. These feelings were inappropriate. Cosa de jóvenes, a thing for the young. He remembered overhearing younger men at the bar sometimes, their crude jokes about women, about sex. It reinforced his feeling that such things were no longer for him, that desire in an old body was somehow grotesque. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and shame, he found himself one night typing awkward phrases into Sophia's old tablet. Sex after 70, loneliness in old age, erectile dysfunction causes. He scanned articles, his face hot. Much of it mirrored what Dr. Ramirez had hinted at, what the original text he'd stumbled upon weeks ago had detailed. The normalcy of desire, the importance of intimacy for health and happiness, the commonality of physical changes, the availability of help. He read about emotional intimacy, about communication, about broadening the definition of closeness beyond the physical act he hadn't experienced in years. He saw mention of lubricants for female dryness, medication for male issues. He even saw the story of a couple finding a second honeymoon after addressing problems. He quickly closed the browser, feeling like a voyeur into a world that wasn't his. Yet, the information lodged itself in his mind, a counterpoint to his ingrained beliefs. His interactions with Isabella continued, slowly deepening. She seemed to sense his internal struggle, his push and pull between wanting connection and fearing it. She never pressed him, never pried, but offered quiet companionship. They started taking short walks together after coffee along the Paseo, Matteo setting the pace due to his knee. They talked about their children, their grandchildren, the changes they'd seen in the town over the decades. He found himself anticipating these walks, the easy silence punctuated by shared observations, the colour of the fishing boats, the antics of the stray cats, the taste of the salt spray on the breeze. One late afternoon, they were sitting on a bench overlooking the sea. The air was warm, scented with salt and the faint sweetness of churros from a nearby stall. They had been talking about gardening, and Matteo had admitted, hesitantly, how much he missed the vibrant blooms Elena used to cultivate. "The garden looks sad," he confessed, staring out at the waves. "Like me, I suppose." It was more than he'd intended to say. Isabella was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "Gardens can be brought back to life, Matteo, with care, patience." She didn't look at him, respecting his vulnerability. And people too, perhaps. He felt a tightness in his throat. He wanted to retreat, to change the subject, but something held him there. He looked at Isabella's profile, the gentle curve of her cheek, the strength in her posture. She wasn't Elena. She was different, vibrant in her own way, accepting of life's blows but refusing to be defined by them. "It's hard," he whispered, the words barely audible above the sigh of the waves. "Being alone." Isabella finally turned to him, her dark eyes full of understanding, not pity. "I know," she said simply. "Antonio, he was my life. For 45 years. When he died, I thought my world had ended." She paused, her gaze returning to the sea. "But it didn't. It changed. Terribly. But it didn't end. We are still here, Matteo. We still feel. We still need." There it was again, that word, need. This time, it didn't spark shame, but a flicker of recognition. He looked down at his weathered hands, hands that had crafted wood, held Elena, rocked his daughter to sleep. They felt empty now. He risked a glance back at Isabella. She was watching him, a question in her eyes. An unspoken invitation, not for romance. Perhaps not even for deep intimacy yet, but for possibility. for not being entirely alone. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sand. A moment stretched between them, filled with the sound of the sea and the weight of unspoken feelings. His old self, the grieving, reserved Matteo, screamed at him to get up, to go home to the safety of his solitude. But another part, a part reawakened by shared coffee, hesitant conversations, and the simple warmth of understanding, urged him to stay, to risk. He cleared his throat. "Isabella," he began, his voice rough. He hesitated, then took the plunge. Perhaps we could have coffee tomorrow? Just coffee." Here Isabella's smile was slow, gentle, reaching her eyes. "I would like that very much, Matteo." A small weight seemed to lift from his chest. It wasn't a grand gesture, just coffee. But it felt like crossing a threshold, stepping out of the shadows of the past into the tentative light of a possible present. He didn't know where this path led, but for the first time in 2 years, he wasn't entirely afraid to find out. The next day, the coffee tasted less bitter. They sat at a small table outside a cafe on the plaza, the morning sun warming their faces. The conversation flowed more easily, punctuated by comfortable silences. Matteo found himself asking Isabella about her planned trip to Cordoba, listening to her enthusiastic descriptions. He even shared a funny story about a stubborn piece of furniture he once made, eliciting a genuine laugh from her. He noticed the way she gestured with her hands when she talked, the thoughtful way she tilted her head when listening. He felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun or the coffee, a simple human connection he realized he had starved himself of. A few days later, Matteo was in his garden. He pulled on thick gloves and began, slowly but determinedly, to tackle the weeds choking the life out of Elena's rose bushes. His knee ached, sweat beaded on his forehead, but there was a satisfaction in the physical work, in the act of clearing away the neglect. He unearthed a small, forgotten ceramic frog Elena had placed there years ago. He smiled, a genuine smile this time, and set it carefully back amongst the leaves. He bought a single bright red geranium from the market and planted it in a pot near the door. A small start. That evening he called Sophia. "Papa, everything all right?" she asked, her usual hint of anxiety. "Everything is fine, Hija," he said, and this time it felt closer to the truth. "I was just working in the garden today, thinking I might plant some tomatoes." There was a surprised silence on the other end. "Tomatoes? That's wonderful, Papa." "And," he added, taking a breath, "I had coffee with a signora from the centre. Isabella, she's nice." He could almost hear Sophia's smile through the phone. "Is she? That's good, Papa."